In this week's In-Ear Insights, a follow-up from last week's episode on predictive analytics and generative AI. We got a comment on YouTube from some folks who said, hey, I thought it was an interesting topic, but I didn't get anything from the episode that was actionable to go experiment with. It would be helpful to analyze an example of how to solve funnel leakage problems with generative AI. They gave an example of a family law firm where traffic's going up and prospects are going up, but sales qualified leads and retainers has stayed flat. And so obviously they're kind of wondering, I'm guessing they're kind of wondering why some of the funnel is moving upwards and some of it isn't. So Katie, when we tackle problems like this for paying clients, we obviously spend a lot more time doing requirements gathering, much more than you would get in a YouTube comment. If this person were to say onboard as a client, what would our first steps be?
I would probably run them through the 5 Ps first and sort of understand, like, what is the purpose? Actually, no, I would step back from there probably and say, I would want to gosh, it's hard because there's so many things that I want to know more about. And so let me see if I can sort of like restructure it. So yeah, let's start with the 5 Ps because that's always a really good place to start. And so, what is the purpose? So the purpose sounds like they are trying to understand, to your point, why some of the funnel is moving and some of the funnel is stagnant. And so, so the question they want to answer is, how do I get the rest of the funnel to start moving again? The people. So, are there salespeople involved? Are there content marketers involved? Whoever's involved. What is the process? I think this to me sounds like where we would probably focus a lot of our time, because at a high level, if some of your funnel is working, but down funnel it's not, that to me says, well, what are you doing in between those steps to, to keep people engaged, to get them to learn more about what it is that you do, to, how long is your sales cycle? Is that part of it? So, there's a lot of questions there. Platform, it depends. Like, let's take a look at their CRM, let's take a look at their website and see if we can figure out if there's any kind of correlation between when people become sales qualified leads or when they drop off. And I think the big question is, at what point are they dropping off or staying stagnant? And then the performance is, did we answer the question? So, that's at a high level, but within each of those, there's a lot to unpack. And for me, the thing that just keeps sticking is what's happening between consideration and purchase that people aren't moving on. So, making sure you know fully what your customer journey is. So that's usually generally like awareness, engagement, consideration, purchase at a very high level. So awareness, people finding out about you for the first time, visiting your website, engagement, people sticking around, maybe signing up for a newsletter or downloading content. Consideration, that's when they start to raise their hand and go, you know what, I think this is the right thing for me. And then purchase is when they complete the transaction. And so I feel like there's something not working between that consideration and purchase. And so that's where I would want to spend the most time is, what content do you have? Are people getting what they need from you because you're giving away too much helpful content and then they're leaving, or they're finding out your prices are wrong and then they're leaving? Like, there's something not working. And again, this is without, further context. So if this was a paying client, we would be able to get into these details. Chris, what would you add to that?
So I wholeheartedly agree. The 5 Ps is the answer to this question. And typically, so in marketing, the difference between a marketing qualified lead and a sales qualified lead is the marketing qualified lead has expressed interest and intent. A sales qualified lead is able to buy, right? So they've got budget, they've got a timeline and things like that. So if you've got a fracture between MQL and SQL, it is the second of the 5 Ps. It's the people. The people that you have as marketing qualified leads may not be buyers, right? You may be, Katie and I, you and I discuss this all the time. I have the Almost Timely newsletter list, which is a huge list. It's 300,000 people, but it's not, the majority of it seems to not be core buyers of Trust Insights. So when I send it out an email and say like, hey, sign up for the Trust Insights webinar coming up, whatever, we get a lot of marketing qualified leads. We get a lot of people who are interested in our services, but they're not buyers. They can't afford to buy, right? If you have a one-person realtor, they can't afford our full service. They can afford our courses and our smaller offerings, but they can't afford the white glove service package that our larger clients have. And so
Right.
our MQLs are very high. Our SQLs are not, because it's the wrong people. And I suspect very strongly in this example of, they were citing a law firm, request consultations, etc. Yeah, I mean, I can request a consultation from a lawyer too, and I can have the free intro 15-minute call, and they're going to realize very quickly, wow, you are not qualified to buy our services. And I think this is a really good example of why you need the 5 Ps to do the requirements gathering, because this is, the person's like, hey, how does predictive analytics and generative AI help? It doesn't. This is not a generative AI problem. This is a process problem.
Right. And, and that's something I always go back to the example that I gave when I was talking about this at Social Media Marketing World of, people leading with, what is the problem I want to solve with generative AI? And that's the wrong question to ask. It's, what is the problem I want to solve? Period. And the example I give is when I was talking with the executive director of the shelter that I volunteer at. She was coming to me with questions about, well, so I've been looking at generative AI, and I have this big spreadsheet of resources that I want to put on my website. And it was a mismatch. She needed a directory plugin for her website, which, by the way, she did figure it out. They're going to do a subdomain because the resources piece is so big. But generative AI doesn't play a role in it. And I think that that's one of the challenges that we're facing today is generative AI is dominating the conversation. It's dominating the news cycle. There's so many things that you can do with it. Is it going to take my job? Can it do the thing? That we just automatically we've created this bias that, well, it must be a generative AI solution, and it might not be. It might be a very, gosh, it sounds so weird to say, it might be an old school solution that doesn't include generative AI. I put that in air quotes, where it's really just, you have to manually take a look at what you're doing, and generative AI doesn't play a role. Now, once you figure out what the problem is, like, okay, so you could use generative AI to create ideal customer profiles. You could sort of use generative AI to do a high level analysis of who your MQLs are and who your SQLs are, and see, like, what's the difference? Like, where does it break down, or get a better ideal customer profile of your paying customers, and then see, is that who's coming to my site? Is that who's getting into my funnel? If the answer is no, that's your problem. And then you can use generative AI to help you put together some sort of a marketing plan. But that analysis of your funnel is not where generative AI belongs. That's a process problem. That's a people problem. And those are the two things in the 5 Ps that solidly do not need generative AI. Those need human intervention. And those are the two things in the 5 Ps that are 100% of the time the most broken
And the hardest to solve,
and the
because,
hardest to solve.
but yeah. So here's a generative AI suggestive approach that I would recommend. And we're going to do this because it mirrors exactly what you were just saying, Katie. So first, we're going to go ahead and we're going to pre-prime the model. We're going to say, let's talk about marketing strategy and funnel leakage. What do you know about this topic, especially in the context of law firms not getting sales qualified leads? Right. So we're going to start it off by filling, essentially having it write its own prompt of, here's what I need to understand about this general topic, right? Here's reasons for leakage, why law firms struggle with this sort of thing. So already, just by asking the question, you have one of the things I think people forget is that generative AI can be a good partner to you. It can be a good, a second opinion. I think generative AI in all instances is a great conversation partner, because it's no different than talking to Wilson the volleyball, right? Except you will actually get better answers. So we've gotten the basic. Now let's take, without the mentions of the generative AI part, because again, we've ascertained immediately this is not a generative AI problem. So we're going to go, okay, great. Here is a current problem our law firm is facing. Please assess and analyze it. And I'm going to put in just here's what's going on, right?
Mhm.
What would you advise?
And so as this is generating the response, the thing to remember, and this is what you tell me all the time, Chris, is that generative AI still has a very high rate of hallucination. And so even if you're asking specific questions, it doesn't mean that the answers are correct. Which is why you ask up front, what do you know about this topic? And even if it says all the right things, it may still not give you good information back. Maybe it's having an off day. Maybe it didn't have coffee that morning, or, maybe it found just the wrong resources to pull from. So you still need that human intervention. So we're not solving the problem with generative AI. We are just sort of doing a little bit of a gut check of, did I think of everything that I can possibly do to solve this problem? It's essentially, I'll probably get a lot of hate for this, but it's a really sophisticated internet search of solutions at this
Okay.
particular stage.
Okay. Let's take a look at what it came up with. Misaligned targeting. Your marketing attracts people who aren't a good match for your ICP.
Mhm,
Ineffective qualification. Your intake process may not be effectively identifying things. Value proposition. Potential clients may not clearly see how you solve their problems or why they choose you over the competition. Nurturing
mhm,
neglect. You might be giving up too quickly on leads. Economic factors.
mhm,
Actionable advice. Data deep dive. Look at your analytics thoroughly. Where do drop-offs happen? Are the demographics of leads changing even while traffic increases? That's a really important one.
mhm,
In Google Analytics, in Adobe Analytics, and all these services, you can gather some percentage of demographic information, but also that should be part of the forms on your website. If you have a form that says not only how did you hear about us, but who the heck are you?
mhm,
Re-examine your ideal client. Again, that's a case where it's a data problem. It could be a classical AI problem of building a regression analysis for what factors determine an ideal client versus not, but it's not going to be a generative AI problem.
right.
Do an intake audit, differentiate, nurture, economic agility. So these answers that it came up with, to exactly your point, Katie, these are your next avenues of investigation. How are you getting your traffic? Where are you
Mhm.
getting your traffic from? Right? Are you getting your traffic from, Craigslist ads? That is still a thing. Oh, they're going to get a very different quality of traffic than you get from, say, a bespoke publication in your city.
And so, back to the original question of, how can I more, you know, make predictive analytics and generative AI more actionable in this particular case? The answer is you're not there yet. First,
Hmm.
you need to understand all of these pieces. You need to understand, so using predictive analytics is not going to tell you why you're having leakage issues. So, one of the things that we talk about is the data analytics hierarchy. And predictive is maybe the third or fourth step up, whereas most companies are stuck at the first baseline, which is what happened. So, it's what happened, why did it happen, what can I do about it? And then I know there's 2 more, but one of them is like, how can I get the machines to do it for me? And so a lot of companies are feeling like they wanna be at the top of that hierarchy, but they're stuck solely at the bottom because they still aren't at the what happened, like, they can't answer those questions easily. That's where you have to start is, what the heck happened in my data before you can take it to the next level of, how can I forecast this? How can I get generative AI to help me through this? And that would be, if this were a paying client, that would be the advice I would give is, like, slap their hands away from generative AI. I not really, maybe, depends on the client. And then I would say, let's just do an analysis of what's going on in your system first. And then once we figure out the what happened, why did it happen, then we can start to bring predictive back in, because you want to be using predictive analytics on the right data, on the correct data. Because if you're doing forecasts on the wrong SQLs or the wrong MQLs, then you're just going to perpetuate the leakage. So, Chris, let's say, we used your newsletter subscriber rates, the month over month, the opens, and all that sort of stuff to figure out when our revenues are going to go up. Well, we already know that it's your newsletter is great for awareness, but it's not great down the funnel. So we would be predicting on the wrong data, and we would be putting resources against the wrong information and continuing to not bring in sales. We'd actually be, losing money at that point.
Exactly. This is a case where predictive analytics with your current data will make things worse. It'll make things worse because you will go down those wrong rat holes, right? If you go and you run a predictive forecast on your current marketing channels and you say, well, email is the best channel or social media is the best channel. Well, yeah, for the wrong audience, right? It's like saying we're going to drive faster on this road. Well, you're on the wrong road. Driving faster is not going to help you. You're still going in the wrong direction. You need to stop the car, look at your map, get on the right road, and then worry about how fast you drive. You can't drive fast enough in the wrong direction to get to where you want to go.
Right. So yeah,
I
mean, yeah. I'm sure someone will happily debate you on that. It won't be me. But I think that that's really what it comes back to is first you need to understand your data. You need to have good data governance. You need to have a good analysis of what's happening in your data and why it's happening before you can get to the stage of using predictive forecasting and generative AI. And I think that that's, it's a common misconception, especially with everything that's happening in the industry right now, is that, well, generative AI can probably just fix this for me. I don't have to think about it anymore. And that's just not true. You, the human, still have to maintain the systems. You still have to do the analysis before you can bring it to a generative AI tool. And that's why in the 5Ps, platform comes after people and process because, and this is the issue with things like digital transformation. It's platform first, maybe people in process. And what we want to change in that narrative and in the implementation is that it's platform last. Don't even think about the type of platform you're using to solve the problem until you understand the problem, until you understand who's involved and what the processes are. And then and only then can you think about the software, the tools. So if you're going into the conversation saying, what is the problem I want to solve with generative AI, you're already setting yourself up for failure.
Yep. Now, to give a little bit of actionable advice to go experiment with, here's how I would solve this problem. What I would do is I would go into the customer's CRM and I ask them, here's your sales here's all of your sales qualified leads and the clients they turned into. I want you to rate the clients, good client, bad client, 0 or 1, right? Good client, bad client, whatever, by whatever criteria you think that is. We take that entire data set out of their CRM. Then you go to a system like generative AI and you say, we're going to write some Python code. Today, we're going to write an autoregressive algorithm that's going to do this sort of binary classification, produce essentially a variable importance chart that will demonstrate which variables contribute to the ideal client, which ones do not. That then you would say, okay, now you have to go back to your marketing automation system and implement a screening process for those specific variables to say, okay, we're going to get more of our ideal clients by filtering out people sooner. To say like, yeah, you're not a trucking company, right? And our ideal customer profile says that trucking companies are who we should be serving, and so you would build that screening process out faster in your system. Again, the part that uses generative AI is essentially writing the code. You've got to know the data, you've got to do the analysis on the data, you've got to know what to ask the system to write the code for, and then you've got to be able to interpret that data. And of the 5Ps, the generative AI part in the platform part is a tiny little portion, but that's the approach that I would take to solve this particular problem. This is why it's not something we can demonstrate in a YouTube video, because it would be a YouTube video is like 18 hours long, right? And display a whole bunch of proprietary confidential data that you definitely do not want people seeing on the internet. But that's the approach. So I would say if this is something that someone wants to go experiment with, that is exactly the approach I would take, is do that data governance, do that requirements gathering, define your ideal customer profile, use machine learning, classical machine learning, to identify the characteristics of that from the data that you have, then take that finding, test it and implement it in your marketing automation systems, and hopefully you get your you hopefully figure out that, yeah, the traffic you're getting is not the right traffic, and then you change your marketing to say, okay, well, we need to chase after those people. And again, you now take all this data you have, feed it back to generative AI, say, let's refine our ideal customer profile and fix our marketing from there. You and I just did this not too long ago. We took a whole bunch of data out of our HubSpot instance and stuff, and we built a much better ICP.
Right. Yeah, no. And I think that, as you're describing it, of course, in the back of my mind, I'm like, yeah, you could do this with machine learning. You don't need to. It depends on how big your database is. It depends on how many customers you have. So, you could, if you know your customer base really, really well, like the way that we do, you could very easily look at the types of customers you have and say, yeah, these were good customers, or these were the wrong fit. They didn't turn into long-term customers. And then take a look at your newsletter subscriber list or your community and just, very quickly go, yeah, I don't see a lot of overlap there. So how do I, go back and get more of these types of clients and really focus on, to your point, Chris, those characteristics. How you arrive at that analysis depends on your skill sets, depends on your resources. And so Chris and I would approach getting to the answer differently, but we would theoretically come up with the same type of information. It's just a matter of, what you can do. And if you have a very large customer base, if you have a very large data set, then you would want to bring on a firm like Trust Insights to help you do that analysis to get there faster, especially if you're finding that you're not meeting your targets as quickly as you need to. I mean, this is true. It doesn't have to be a law firm. This is for any company who's like, I don't know why my revenue is not moving. I don't know what's wrong with my funnel. Like, that's the kind of analysis that we can do with our deep bench of knowledge with classical machine learning.
You raise a really good point. Sparsity is going to be an issue for companies that have a smaller data set. We ran into this in the first year of Trust Insights, right? We just didn't have enough data because we didn't have enough clients at that point. And you'll find that out when you do the variable importance analysis, because you will get a measure of statistical significance, and it will tell you this data set you cannot predict from. You cannot do this analysis from because there's just not enough data. What that number is depends on all the algorithms you choose. And again, that's something you can ask generative AI for, but you probably should know what it's saying when it says, well, you could use ARIMA or ARMA or any of these different algorithms for time series forecasting. You could use gradient boosting or stochastic gradient descent or even just flat out linear regression or logistic regression for the prediction. If those words don't mean anything, then generative AI is not going to help anything, because it's going to be a lot of digging around to figure out what that means. But that's at the point where you'd figure out, yeah, this is not going to go well. And at that point, you then absolutely should be relying on essentially human intuition, right? What you were talking about is, say, like, if your company, if a very specific kind of company, and in your region there's 10 of them, you don't need AI for that. You need to go and go to the golf course and spend time with the 10 CEOs of those 10 companies.
I would like to break that stereotype just for a second. So I'm a CEO of a company and I hate golf. So if someone says, hey, I want to take you to the golf course, I would say, you need to keep walking and find someone else. I hate golf. But I understand what you're saying. So basically, you need to find a way to reach, those decision makers, and so it really depends on, well, I guess it really starts with, do you know who your ideal client is? And are you getting that ideal client? And if the answer is, I think so, maybe, you need to be 100% sure about that, because that is going to dictate all of the other things that you're doing.
Exactly. And there is no substitute for the legwork. There is no substitute for the data governance, for the research and stuff. Generative AI helps, as we've said many times. Language models in particular help with language problems. The comment that the person left on YouTube is not a language problem. It is a data quality problem. And generative AI will not make that better, and predictive analytics will make that worse. So if you do have a situation like this where you have some questions about it, here's our contact information. Just go to trustinsights.ai/contact, and we're happy to have a chat with you about solving the problem and whether you're solving it with the right tools or not, because that's literally what we do. If you've got some scenarios that you want to share and have a chat with, go to our free Slack group. Go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, where you and over 3,000 other marketers are asking and answering each other's questions every single day. And wherever it is you watch or listen to today's show, if there's a channel you'd rather have it on instead, go to trustinsights.ai/TI podcast, and you can find us on most podcast sources. And while you're on your channel of choice, please leave us a rating and a review. It does help to share the show. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.